Journey of the Sparrows, Chapter 11. I watched as Donna Elena washed and weighed the baby in the kitchen. When Julia groaned again, Donna Elena said, "It's the afterbirth," and handed the baby to me. I stood in the kitchen, holding it close against my chest. The baby slept, but I placed my finger against its hand, and its fingers locked around it. Our skin was exactly the same color. I thought of Mama and how she would love to hold the baby, her first grandchild. I thought of little Teresa and her birth, just a season before the Guardias came. I touched the soft hair on the baby's head and felt my chest swell with love and sorrow. She was alive, safe. Donna Elena would register her so she would even be a citizen. Then why? Why did she have to be so dark-skinned? She would know enough pain. "Julia's okay now," Donna Elena called to me from the other room. "Bring the baby back to her." I took the baby into Julia and placed it against her. Julia moved it to her breast, but the baby was sleepy and didn't want to nurse. Later, Donna Elena said softly. I bent down to Julia. "She's wonderful, but I should check on Oscar and go to the church to clean, and maybe sleep." I was so tired my arms and legs almost wouldn't move. "I'll keep Julia here for a few days," Donna Elena said to me, "so she can get some strength, and that way I can watch over the baby. She's small." And turning to Julia, she said, "But healthy, thanks be to God." I stopped to see Oscar and told him, "You have a new niece, Oscar Sparrow. You'll have to look after her." He smiled brightly. I fed him a tortilla I'd brought from Donna Elena, and then went to the church. Father Jonathan was there when I arrived. "You look tired," he said. "Is everything all right?" His slanted blue eyes were kind behind his glasses, and I noticed that his blonde red hair had been cut, so his neck seemed longer. I smiled. "I have a new niece. She was born a little while ago." He asked about the baby, said he was happy for us, and told me to go home and rest. They'd pay me anyway. So I went back to our mattress and slept until it was nearly dusk. After Donna Elena let me in her door that evening, she sat back down in her rocking chair, closed her eyes, and slept sitting up. I walked quietly into the birth room. Julia lay awake on her side, rubbing the baby's cheek. She glanced up at me, her eyes smiling. "I am going to call her Ramona," she said. "Little Ramona, Ramona." She caressed the baby's head. "I will be a sunbeam and enter your window," she sang quietly. I sat on the stool next to her and stroked one little arm that had come loose from the blanket. Julia smiled. "You were so much help to me, little sister. I don't know what I'd have done without you. I know it must have been hard for you. You're young. You shouldn't have to do all of this." "It wasn't hard. You were brave. And you've got your baby. She's alive, and Donna Elena says she's healthy. I stopped at the church to thank the Virgin." I bent my head. Julia looked at me closely for a minute. "What's wrong?" she whispered. "Something with Oscar?" "No, nothing's wrong. He's fine. Everything's fine." "Maria, tell me why you're unhappy." "I'm not unhappy." I turned away from her. My eyes held tears. "What is it? Something wrong with the baby? Or Oscar? You're not telling me?" Her voice rose in alarm. I panicked. No. "Then what?" I started to say no again, but Julia cried. "What's wrong?" My voice broke. "I'm afraid the baby's going to be dark like me. She doesn't look like you. She won't be beautiful. I'm thankful she's alive, but what if she looks like me?" Julia stared at me, her mouth slightly open. There was silence as she looked from my face, down to the baby, and back to my face. "I didn't know you felt like that about your color," she said. I nodded, ashamed. Julia focused her eyes on the wall behind me, thinking. As she turned back to me, I dropped my head. "You don't realize how good you are. You don't know how proud of you I am," she said. "You don't know how lovely you're becoming, how happy I'd be if Ramona looked like you." I shook my head, tears on my cheeks. "I didn't," I whispered. "Just like you." Julia smiled at me and bent my head against her. I cried with my arms around my sister. Julia returned home with the baby, and we played with her for hours every day. Baby Ramona cooed, kicked her little legs, and when I'd touch her cheek with my bent finger, she'd turn to it with her mouth and try to nurse. Her hair was long, and we'd comb it one way or another. When we were in our apartment, Julia carried the baby tied against her chest and stomach with a shawl. The old way mothers sometimes still carried newborns at home. I also kept looking for food and money to pay our part of the rent. I sold 3 more paintings, found a job washing dishes in a restaurant 2 nights a week, and worked at the church a few hours each day, often getting groceries from them. Julia watched Marta's daughters while Marta worked, but Marta was unable to find me a cleaning job like hers. Because she was nursing Ramona, Julia needed to eat even more, but we were all better off than we'd been before. I was so thankful I'd trusted Father Jonathan. When I could, I practiced my English and did sketches of the baby to send to Mama. We received short letters back from her, assuring us that Teresa was still alive. With the arrival of spring, the world came alive with people. Flowing out from buildings in the warm weather, children played on the sidewalks and in the streets. Groups of boys and girls my age hung around cars and doorsteps, listening to music and flirting with one another, and old people sat on ragged landings, staring at the activity below them. One morning, Tomas knocked on our door. When I opened it, he said, "Bring Oscar and come with me quickly. I've hidden something in the back so nobody will steal it." My hand went to my necklace as I looked at Julia. She nodded. So Oscar and I followed Tomas behind our building. Tomas moved some boards, then smiled. He shrugged and said, "I rebuilt a wagon for Oscar and Marta's girls, maybe even Julia's baby." He flipped his curly hair out of his face, beaming. Oscar climbed into the wagon. The wheels of the wagon didn't match. It was rusty and it had to be pulled by a rope. But it worked. "Someday I want my own repair shop," Tomas said, smiling broadly. "That's why I'm working so hard on my English." I looked at him with awe. I didn't know people like us could own a shop in the north. "Let's take Oscar to the park," he said. Tomas pulled Oscar down the streets, and I felt proud, holding my back straight and my face soaking up the warm sun. I'd washed my hair that morning and could feel it warm on my shoulders. It seemed as if my arms and legs fit together better than they had the year before. I looked over at Tomas and felt the happiest I'd been since we had left our home. We walked close together so our shoulders sometimes touched. We finally came to the park. I nearly cried when I saw all of the trees touched with spring leaves. It was like home, where there is a sea of green in the wet season, fog rising in the morning, and a piercing blue sky. Pigeons flew up and around the park, and I thought of the eagle we'd seen once in the mountains, soaring in the sky with its eyes scanning the brush and crops. The sidewalks in the park were laid out like spokes in a wheel, meeting as the roads met in the plaza in a village near my home. A yellow disc flew through the sky like a ball from one person to another. "A frisbee," Tomas said. "A frisbee," I repeated, as did Oscar. We walked slowly and noticed a group of people gathering in one corner of the park. Children's laughter was coming from it. "I want to see," Oscar pleaded, so we walked closer to the group. As we approached, we saw small balls being tossed into the air with a steady rhythm. "A juggler," Tomas said with excitement. Oscar got out of the wagon and edged into the group. I followed him, trying to keep my hand on his shoulder. A man dressed in tight black and white clothes and wearing black and white makeup on his face stood in the center of the people. The only color was the red painted on his mouth and the red balls he tossed upward. Oscar kept pushing forward until he was almost next to the man. Then Oscar sat on the grass, his mouth open and smiling. He stared up with amazement at the balls, moving his hands as if he was juggling. The man noticed Oscar's movements, caught all 3 balls with one hand, bowed down at Oscar, and touched him on the nose with his finger. Oscar giggled, and the man bent down, picked a bright yellow flower near his foot, and handed it to Oscar. The other children laughed and clapped. I glanced back at Tomas, who stood behind us in the group. When he saw me, he arched his eyebrows and winked. After the juggler had moved on, Tomas and I sat together on a park bench, watching Oscar pick yellow flowers and listening to what Tomas told me was country music playing on a nearby radio. Birds sang as if happy the winter was over, and a cat stalked near us, reminding me of the Quetzal lady's kitten. Tomas smiled to himself and tapped his foot to the music. I looked up at the trees. The light glistened off the new yellow-green leaves, and the breeze seemed to make them dance. Then Tomas moved his hand next to mine so they touched it, and through his fingers I felt the warmth of his whole body. Oscar came back to us and climbed on my lap, clutching his flowers. I took one of the round, yellow blossoms and tucked it behind my ear. Tomas turned so he could look directly in my face. "They're called dandelions," he said. "You look pretty. It matches your locket." I flushed and glanced down. "Gracias," I said, but then looked up again, directly into his eyes. Tomas pulled Marta's daughters home in the wagon that evening, and as Oscar fell asleep, I told him the story of the sparrow who sang out the colors. As I told it, the sparrow's song reached out with all the colors of the rainbow and touched Julia, Oscar, baby Ramona, and me. Then the colors went down the steps and through the streets to Marta's, where they wrapped around Tomas, Marta, and her girls, brushed against Dona Elena and Father Jonathan, and headed south until they finally reached Mama and Teresa.